Good morning. Can you hear me back there? Wow, it's just so great to be here. So many familiar faces, and this new building is just amazing. I mean, I would come here just for the bathrooms, which are, I'm not kidding, because we used to talk about how, if we ever had a beautiful building, the bathrooms are really important, and that's something that people think about when they choose a place to go for lunch or whatever. So this building is a great accomplishment, and you had to break a few eggs to make it, but it fits into the garden beautifully, and there's these wonderful vistas, and it's just a thrill. I'd like to thank a few people really quickly, too. I hope this doesn't cut into my 10 minutes. Becky, for inviting me, thank you so much, and Carolyn for hosting me, and to Brian and Walker for, putting so much love and care into the garden and, carrying on Ruth's vision and legacy. So I get to talk about flow. Flow, sorry, and, oops, there we go, flow. And that's really one of my favorite topics when it comes to art. And I want to sort of touch on a few of the things that I learned from Ruth, mainly through working in her garden, but a little bit from talking with her too, about creating compositional flow in the garden. And so what is compositional flow? Compositional flow is basically how your eye moves through a composition. And, Ruth's unique way of creating flow, I think, is part of what defines her signature. And, what Ruth's signature was something that interested me when I came to the garden and interests me now. What made this garden Ruth's garden and not someone else's? Because, the same plant palette in someone else's hands would have resulted in something totally different. So hopefully, talking about some of the aspects of the way Ruth created flow in her garden will help answer that question of, what her signature was. So to get at the concept of compositional flow, I'd just like you to take a look at a painting for a moment. And just notice when you look at that painting, how your eye kind of moves through it and where it pauses. And pauses are like super important. So, everyone has a different idea of what flow is, and just like Antonio was saying, everyone has a different sort of idea of what makes this garden special. Well, for me, what makes this garden special is not just the plant palette, but what Ruth did with the plants to create all the layers of flow that she did. So, this painting is the definition of really good flow for me. And I think Ruth would have agreed with me. And I think it's fun to imagine this painting coming alive, but not as wheat fields and wildflowers in northern France, but as a succulent garden in Northern California. And I think it's not a stretch to compare Van Gogh and Ruth, or Van Gogh's painting in Ruth's garden, because they both have this super original and recognizable way of creating visual flow. And I think Vince and Ruth have a lot in common on that score. So just to go over some of the basics of visual flow, whether it be a painting or a sculpture or whatever, you have color, you have line, texture, shape. Where's my next one? Scale. Scale is super important. And pauses. Pauses are one of the defining factors when you're creating flow, because if you don't have pauses, it's like circular and it can be monotonous, and there's nothing monotonous or boring about Van Gogh or Ruth's painting, Ruth's garden. And then because Ruth was designing with plants, there's the factors of lots of other factors, but plant habit is super important, because she was dealing with that living three-dimensional artwork that we call a garden. So habit was really, really important. So those are the basics of flow, the elements of flow. So one of the hallmarks of a really well laid out garden with good flow is that the composition holds up from whatever the vantage point. So this was taken on top of an orchard ladder, looking back towards the folly. And I'm pretty sure Ruth never looked at the garden from that angle, but she may as well have, because there's a definite hand in the placement of these plants. And I chose this slide because I think it does a really good job of illustrating, I would say, 5 of the main ways that Ruth created visual flow or compositional flow in her garden. So, there's layers and layers of flow in there with color, line, texture, you name it. But I just kind of want to zero in on, the spiky blob in the foreground. That is the yucca. And, your eye doesn't really care if it's a yucca or a palm. It just recognizes this dramatic form. And, when we see something interesting like that, we look and see if there's another one. And sure enough, there's lots of these spiky blobs throughout the picture there. And the next thing, because we're human, we look for patterns. Because we want to see if there's any order to it. And sure enough, there is an order. Now, even though Ruth didn't design this from this perspective, like I said, she may as well have, because you can see there's a very distinct rhythm and pattern created by these different plant forms. And, I just want to mention that, all of these things I'm going to mention, repetition and rhythm, Ruth didn't make these up. These are just tried and true techniques to create visual flow, but she had her own, spin on it. And I think that one of the things Ruth did differently than a lot of people is she gave herself the freedom to experiment with a lot of different forms that looked similarly but were different species of plants, and freely intermingled them to create rhythms. And these rhythms are really, really important throughout the garden. And as I was working in the garden, oh, can you hear me okay? Sorry. As I was working in the garden on a day-to-day basis, whatever little area I was working in, I was always looking for the rhythm in that area. And as I was telling Becky yesterday, sometimes it was like a record playing along nicely, and then there'd be like a scratch in the record. And you'd be like, so what happened to the rhythm? And so then the conversation would go something like this: hey, Brian, what was Ruth's intent in this area? What can we do to rearrange the plants or add or subtract to recreate that flow or that rhythm and get things moving again? So, and as gardeners and designers, that's kind of what we're always doing. We're always adding, subtracting, fixing. Every time we pull out a weed or move something, it's all in pursuit of whatever our idea of better flow is. And it just so happens that Ruth is really, really good at it, and she had years and years to work on it. So I forgot that I have a little animated thing here. So we have repetition, and then you naturally have rhythm. It's what you do with those repetitions. And the next thing you have is drifts or masses, and that is super important, especially in a garden that has such a broad palette and so many disparate elements, is the sort of technique of creating drifts or masses of plants to give the eye a resting spot or just to calm the whole composition down. And, it's not like me when I plant a garden or design a garden, I'll go out and buy a drift. I'll buy enough plants to create a drift. Ruth planted stuff and allowed them to evolve into drifts over time. And then she curated them and managed them to create the effects that she wanted. But using those drifts or streaks of color or texture are super important and a great way to create movement and garden visual movement and to sort of glue things together. Next thing is pauses. And pauses are really important. I kind of put that up there right by that bubblegum pink. Is that a silk floss tree, Becky? Back there, yeah. So Ruth was so good at creating pauses. And this is a good time to talk about the difference between a pause and an interruption. Pauses are like nice moments in the garden. You think, how nice, it's beautiful, something seasonal, something interesting, different. But it doesn't like stop your eye. Your eye just pauses there, it rests, and then it kind of moves on to everything else. An interruption is rude, and that's something that you wish weren't there. So maybe a sick plant, weeds, or a rake left out. That's something I'm well known for, or a weirdly placed sign or something like that. Things that you just wish weren't there. Those are interruptions. But what? Oh, Tababuya pink cloud. Okay. So thanks for that. That's the pink up there. But you'll notice there's not like 5 of them up there. There's just one, just enough to catch your eye, and then your eye kind of moves on. And I think one thing that Ruth did so well is to create those pauses, but incorporate them into the rhythms that she had created. So let's see. The last thing is Ruth's management of scale, and Antonia touched on that too. And you can't really ignore that when you come to this garden. You know, Ruth, I think she gardened very intuitively, but she definitely had these preferences and tendencies, and she also had a really unusually good sense of being able to project what things were going to look like at their mature state. And so she laid out her plants very, very consciously and with a sense of organization, because there's one thing I know for sure about Ruth is she was a very, very organized individual. And she created this incredible backbone of the garden with the larger elements. And one thing that I noticed, especially in retrospect, is how she sort of clustered the taller things in her garden towards the perimeter, the bigger, chunkier plants. And then as you get to the middle of the garden, there's smaller plants with smaller shade patterns. And the tempo of the garden changes on the perimeter of the garden. And then modulates as you get to the middle to something that's more like intense. So that there's a feeling of like a nucleus in the garden where, you know, the design is more clamped down, and you know, the euphorbia beds, for example, come to mind. But then on the edges, your eye kind of moves around in the canopy of the trees and in the mid-story and in the looser plantings that she sort of focused on the edges. So that created this kind of big flow like this in the garden that I haven't really seen a lot in other gardens. So where the canopy of the trees is so well orchestrated. And I think that sort of adds a level of maturity and sort of nuance to the garden that you just don't see a lot in other gardens. Let's see, I guess that really is pretty much all on my slides. I just thought I'd like to show you 2 other little angles that just sort of hopefully supports that claim that no matter what angle that you look at the garden, the composition holds together. These were all just pictures taken in the course of just documenting the garden. Never thought I'd need them. And I'd like to just end on this one little corner of the garden that no longer exists, but it's something that I think it's worth looking at because it wasn't designed by Ruth, but it was definitely inspired by Ruth. And when we put this garden, this little corner together, I think if I do say so myself, I think we did a pretty good job of ringing all the bells that I was just talking about. You know, there's, you know, a good rhythm in there. There's repetition of various forms. There's a beautiful little resting spot with that V-shaped yucca baccata in there, and it just kind of all hangs together. And at the time, it did a good job of sort of leading your eye into the garden, which was exactly what we were trying to do. And so I think that is a nice place to end because it shows that, you know, the lessons that Ruth left us, the design lessons that she left us with, are very, very accessible and out there for us to enjoy and use in our own work. And I know that, you know, working here and, you know, trying to understand Ruth's garden and learn her garden, you know, really helped me as a garden designer. And I use, you know, the lessons that I got from here every day, you know, when I, you know, get to someone's house and have to sort of work on the flow in their garden, you know, I have a lot to draw on from my experience here. So that's about it. Thank you.